Hello everyone, I'm Dawn. Welcome to my channel, The Cutting Board. Thank you for visiting with me today. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. We do all kinds of things on this channel. We do vlogs, taste tests, cooking, makeup, crafts, SFX makeup, true crime, discussions, Disney, all kinds of stuff, whatever I feel like doing. In this video, we are going to tackle the subject of autism and other intellectual disabilities and the prison system. The reason why I want to discuss this is because a lot of people want Nicholas Godejohn, the young man who was convicted of stabbing to death Gypsy Rose Blanchard's mother, Dee Dee, to be given a new trial. And many want him housed in a long-term mental health facility. And there are some people that think that he should just be free because he's autistic and was manipulated. But he still did do what he did, and autism is not an excuse. In 2018, a Toronto man, Alec Manassian, rammed a van into pedestrians, killing 10 people and injuring 16 others. He did admit to planning the whole thing. He pleaded not guilty, claiming that he couldn't be held responsible because he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when he was 6 years old. There are claims that he was part of misogynistic online forums, that he had been manipulated and radicalized in the incel community to jumpstart an incel uprising. So because he was allegedly manipulated and has autism, should he also get the same consideration they want Nicholas Godejohn to get? Although I do understand that Nick's supporters' hearts are in the right place, there are some issues that just cannot be ignored. First of all, there is the cost. Although it is expensive to house a prisoner for life in a traditional correctional facility, the cost for the prison system is much greater to house someone for life in a mental health facility. Housing a prisoner in a traditional correctional center is around $50,000 a year, give or take. An inmate with mental health needs at around $33,000 to $168,000 a year. To house an inmate in a state mental health facility is about $242,000 to $330,000 a year. Now, it does include more intense therapy than they would get in a traditional prison, that being one-on-one therapy, support groups, and allowable medication. The benefit of a mental health facility is that more intense therapy, around-the-clock attention, and an often calmer setting. And one of the main focuses of a mental health facility is to keep patients out of solitary confinement, which is very dangerous for autistic people, or being restricted from programs as behavior modification, and to help the patient/prisoner learn how to navigate life on the outside. That's not a concern for those sentenced to life. Also, the prison system is only going to provide the minimum necessary standard of care. And if that minimum necessary standard is provided by the prison system in a traditional correctional facility, it would not be justified to send the prisoner to a hospital at an additional expense to, the system. Just to note, figures you find online are wildly incorrect. These numbers I'm using were obtained from the Department of Justice Office of Public Affairs Statistics Analysis, unless I state otherwise. In the United States, prison staff have used unnecessarily excessive and malicious force on prisoners with mental disabilities, which is not only completely ineffective, it is cruel and callous. And, just my opinion, perhaps those using those tactics need to be put on trial themselves. Staff are authorized to use force to gain control for the purposes of protection and safety, but it's no secret that they abuse this authorization. Under the U.S. Constitution on force against any prisoner, it may be used only as a last resort and never punitively. Intellectually challenged inmates are often a favorite target because they oftentimes can be manipulated into keeping it a secret. More needs to be done to prevent these things from happening, and that's why I bring it up. I don't know if Nicholas Godejohn has had to face this kind of maltreatment, but it's something that we should think about, so I felt it necessary to bring up. Now, I have zero doubts that Nicholas Godejohn has intellectual disabilities, including autism. We know he has autism. His interrogation clearly showed me that he didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. Although he does know right from wrong, and he understood that what he did was a bad thing, the detective clearly saw he was challenged, and she took advantage of that. After watching the interrogation several times, there is no question he possesses no guile. He's honest almost from the very start. He tries to lie in the beginning, but is just unable to do so. It's just not in him to fib. He doesn't ask for a lawyer. Now, I realize Gypsy didn't ask for an attorney either until the end of the interrogation, but I honestly feel that she didn't ask for one early on because I think she felt like she could manipulate her way out of it. Nicholas didn't ask for an attorney because I feel like he didn't fully understand his rights. His challenges, although not all are specifically known, it is apparent that they exist. It's very noticeable, which is easy to see just by how he talked about a ham sandwich. I don't excuse what he did, and for the charge, I think the sentence is appropriate as well as in line with the law. The question is, did he really get a fair trial? And there are those who believe his inability or lack of understanding of his rights during his interrogation should have been all it took for the judge to find that he was not mentally fit to be tried due to mental disease or defect. But there really is more to it than that. But that is a hard case to make for anyone with the way that plea is defined. Not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect is a plea that a defendant can enter if they were legally insane at the time of the crime, which is hard to prove. The mental disease or defect prevented them from understanding the nature of their actions, knowing right from wrong, or understanding the consequences of their actions. This would be a difficult defense for Nicholas because of all the communications between he and Gypsy. He may have been able to plead diminished capacity, which is a theory that, due to unique factors, allows the defendant to argue their mental state was impaired and lacked the mental capacity to understand right from wrong. For this plea, the defendant would be found guilty of a lesser charge, whereas not guilty due to mental disease or defect would result in a not guilty verdict, however, may result in admission to a mental health facility. I don't feel either of these options apply because he did know right from wrong, and he even tried to get Gypsy to just run away with him, which implies he knew that it was wrong. He didn't want to do it. He knew it was wrong. But in the end, he did do it. To examine how diminished capacity is used as a defense, you can reference Metrish versus Lancaster 569 U.S. 351 from 2013. I don't want to discuss that case here because this video would end up being 4 hours long. It is important to mention here that not guilty due to mental disease or defect is not the same as incompetent to stand trial. One has to do with when the crime was committed. The second is about the mental state during trial. 1% of defendants plead insanity, and 26% of that 1% are found not guilty. 4% of prisoners in the U.S. are intellectually disabled violent offenders. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice statistics, about 4% of prisoners in the United States have autism spectrum disorder. That number can actually be higher because of missed or underdiagnosed prior to prison, and there is no screening for autism in many corrections facilities, although they do have screening in some. Although there are court mandates for mental health care, more than 50% of prisoners who were taking medication for mental health conditions or disorders at the time of their initial incarceration had to abruptly discontinue their medication once going to prison. About 63% of inmates with a history of mental illness did not receive treatment while in prison, although a percentage of that 63% refused this treatment. Inmates with autism, they have a higher risk of things like self-harm and disruptive behaviors, and for those disruptive behaviors, traditional corrections practices would be ineffective on these individuals. That's not to say that members of the autistic community are more likely to commit violent crimes, but of those that do commit violent crimes and are incarcerated, have a high percentage within that small community of having or developing concomitant mental disorders. Signs of autism spectrum disorder, according to Dr. M. Blattstein's blog at pprsus.com, are repetitive or ritualistic behaviors, having difficulty with everyday conversations, sharing emotions or interests less often than peers, having difficulty responding to or understanding social cues, having difficulty understanding other people's facial expressions or emotions, having delayed speech or language skills, having trouble developing or understanding relationships, doing repetitive actions such as hand flapping or rocking, becoming intensely interested in certain topics, speaking in atypical ways such as in a sing-song voice, that's just an example, having a significant need for predictable structure and order, becoming overwhelmed or angry in new situations, having a sensitivity to certain stimulants such as being overwhelmed by loud noises or bright lights, experiencing intellectual delay. According to Dr. Blattstein's blog, there are only 2 facilities able to adequately care for autistic inmates with programming. They are low and medium security prisons, so someone convicted of such a serious charge as Nicholas Godejohn probably would not qualify. I will provide the link to that blog below in the description. It is a very interesting read. Check it out. 1 in 4 prisoners in the United States has an intellectual disability, with 23% being significant cognitive disorder. Currently, U.S. prisons house more than 500,000 people with intellectual disabilities, some being very mild, but a lot are very serious, including prisoners with Down syndrome. Prisoners with autism and cognitive disorders have a greater risk of being exploited by prison staff and fellow inmates. They also are disproportionately disciplined with segregation and solitary confinement, which is not only cruel and unusual punishment for an intellectually disabled individual, it causes further mental suffering, including development of other mental illnesses like PTSD and intellectual disabilities caused by environmental deprivation. While I agree this does have to change, and the prison system does need to work on how they work with intellectually disabled prisoners, It is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed, and reform is necessary. But again, we move on to Nicholas. I understand many feel violent criminals shouldn't be given any extra help, but those people have probably never suffered from or have cared for someone with an actual intellectual disability. Prison should be humane, especially if they are to one day be released into society. But even if they are serving life, it's about rehabilitation, mental health, safety, dignity, community, humanity, and punitive conditions and maltreatment will yield psychologically damaged prisoners in a worse state of health, both mental and physical, than when they first entered the prison system. Humane prison conditions reduce violence in prisons as well. I understand that a lot of these people have committed heinous crimes, but it's about overall health, well-being, and safety of the whole system, including prison staff. Prison reform is necessary, and I'm absolutely not arguing that point, not at all. My argument is this: if Nicholas Godejohn is transferred to a mental health facility for his autism and possibly other intellectual disabilities, every single other violent offender with intellectual disabilities should also be offered the same consideration, which would be a huge undertaking for the criminal justice system. Granted, it would be their responsibility, but they aren't required to take it on. They're only required to provide the minimum necessary level of care. Although the criminal mental health facilities can help reduce recidivism and the cost of recidivism, that would not be something that would apply to someone to be housed for life. I also argue this: the mental health treatment Nicholas would receive in a mental health facility for violent offenders would be more than likely similar to what he is receiving already or has the option to receive in prison at a fraction of the cost, which Potosi Correctional Facility, where Nicholas is housed, said that they do provide this care, and this has been confirmed by some prisoners and former prisoners interviewed for research purposes. Someone sentenced to life is not going to benefit from re-entry programs. In a hospital setting, he would get more intense care and around-the-clock care, which would still have to be considered medically necessary. So it would have to be deemed medically necessary before that was a thing, for not only his condition, but his sentence. And contrary to what seems to be popular belief, mental health facilities for criminals are not really any more safe than prison. They are underfunded, understaffed, and turnover rates are extremely high. Non-medical staff, such as security, are often undertrained and don't fully understand the intricacies of working with these special needs prisoners. While I do agree Nicholas Godejohn does need to be under the care of mental health professionals for his own well-being, because well-being should still be important even if he's there for life, and his quality of life, there are thousands of other inmates across the U.S. that I feel would need the same consideration. Have the same energy for all of these inmates, not just the one made famous by Gypsy Rose. I urge everyone who truly care about how prisoners with mental disabilities, autism, and mental illness are treated, not just one prisoner with mental disabilities, but all, to get involved. Please get involved with human rights efforts for changes in prisons. You can reach out to your local, state, and federal executive branch and legislative officials to improve prison conditions, to provide all inmates more humane confinement and solitary confinement for those with mental disabilities, a proven ineffective tactic for people with mental disabilities. It is. Improve mental health services in prison, offer opportunities for open communication about one's mental health need, like their own needs, collecting data to better educate those in power on what other treatments or practices would be beneficial. Better monitor staff to ensure force policies are strictly enforced. Demand use of force policies, including provisions specifically addressing the needs of prisoners with intellectual disabilities. Support funding for programs to ensure appropriate interventions for individuals with intellectual disabilities and mental health concerns at every stage of the criminal justice system process. If you're only thinking about Nicholas and not acknowledging the needs of other challenged prisoners, you aren't concerned about fairness. Because you say it's not fair that, people say it's not fair that Gypsy is out of prison and Nicholas is not. But if you're only concerned about fairness to Nicholas while all these other mentally disabled people are suffering in prison, then you don't care about fairness. You're not concerned about fairness, because if you really cared about what was fair, you would care about the big picture. I haven't seen change.org petitions for every easily manipulated, mentally challenged prisoner. Just Nick. And you need to face it. There are more out there, thousands more. They just haven't been made famous. So I ask you to not only hold the justice system responsible for fair and balanced treatment of Nicholas Godejohn, if you feel he wasn't treated fairly in court, but also consider and have that same energy for the thousands of other inmates who had similar outcomes due to intellectual disabilities and, manipulation. No killer should be free to walk the streets, but the conditions in which they're being held should be dramatically improved for those with serious mental challenges and, again, intellectual disabilities. We can't ignore the fact that by the letter of the law and by definition, Nicholas was found guilty of first-degree murder. He did know it was wrong, and he did it anyway. I'm not saying that he wasn't manipulated, but he had a choice until he put that knife in Dee Dee. I don't believe he should be released. He got the appropriate sentence for the crime that he committed. The only other option for him under the law was the death penalty. I do not support the idea of a reduced sentence, and it's just not likely to happen anyway. But I do support improvements and implementation of programs for intellectually disabled inmates, as well as appropriate training and monitoring of staff who work with intellectually disabled inmates. Rehousing him in a long-term mental health facility may seem like a great idea until thousands of other prisoners want the same. The bottom line is what it is going to be most cost effective to the prison system. Even with reform, they are going to take the extremes and make them meet almost in the middle, with favor being towards the less expensive route. Thank you for listening and considering what I have to say. I appreciate you being here. I'll talk to everyone later. All of the sources I use are in the About section if you're interested in further reading. Thank you so much for visiting, and I'll talk to everyone later. Bye.